So we've dealt with pests in the past, and with our corn in particular, we've had field mice. But this year we noticed that we had a lot of damage on our corn, and then one day we came to the plot and we discovered the culprit. We saw two grey squirrels which had been ravaging the corn and were making their escape. One in fact had a cob in its mouth. Hi, welcome to WeSow, and in today's episode we're going to talk to you about 5 tips for surviving a difficult season. Now, for anybody who's familiar with how 2024 has been, it has been a very difficult season because of unseasonal weather, and we had a lot of rain, and so it brought out a lot of slugs, and we also had erratic weather during the early spring. And with all of this in mind, we still made sure that we would persevere. Now, the first tip I'd like to share, which is rooted in our experience for this year, is firstly to watch the weather rather than watching the calendar. Now, typically when people garden, they look at the calendar which tells them when they should do certain things, and generally that is fantastic advice to follow. However, sometimes when you have a difficult season, when the conditions are unseasonal, you find that although the calendar says you must do certain things like put certain plants out, you may find that the weather that we get may break the convention. And this is what happened with us, because we planted out certain plants and we found that although it was optimum to plant them based on the calendar, the reality was that the weather was so erratic that blazing hot temperatures came out which killed certain plants, and also we would have had seasons or periods where there was a lot of rain, and so we had some difficulties and failures with some of the crops because the weather wasn't matching up. Whereas if we had just paid attention to what we were seeing with our eyes, then we would have put certain things out a little bit later and avoided some of the pitfalls. So just remember that if the weather is not matching up with your expectations, then just keep an eye on it to find the best time to put out your young plants. Now this takes us to the second tip, which is make sure that you have spare plants. And the reason why it's good to have spare plants is because if anything fails with the seedlings that you've started, you can always just try again and replenish. And this was really useful for us because, for example, with the corn, even though we lost some corn plants, the fact that we were able to get some more through extra sowings, we were able to replace the ones that had failed when the weather had disappointed us. And also with the beetroots, we had a big problem with the slugs eating a lot of our seedlings, and we found that by planting some of our extra plants, or should I say retrieving some of our extra plants, the excess ones we had sown, we were able to replace ones that had been eaten by the slugs. So remember that, plant extra and keep those spares for difficult times. Now the third thing to be mindful of, or the third tip, is expect the unexpected. And what that means is that it's best at times to not assume that past success is an indicator of how the season will go. So this year we had problems which we had never encountered before, even though we have been doing this for the good part of 8 years. So we've dealt with pests in the past, and with our corn in particular we've had field mice, but this year we noticed that we had a lot of damage on our corn. And then one day we came to the plot and we discovered the culprit. We saw two grey squirrels which had been ravaging the corn and were making their escape. One in fact had a cob in its mouth. And so although in the previous 7 years we had never had attacks from squirrels, that alone was not sufficient to assume that it couldn't happen. And so that's an example of why, although we may have a certain season in past years, that we should just always be prepared just in case something unexpected happens. And so because of that, we were able to mitigate. And so what we did was we decided to cover our cobs, or the ones that survived, with plastic bottles that were cut so that we could protect them from squirrels. Now this takes us to the next tip, which is to be flexible. Tip number 4. And what that means is, although things may not go according to plan, although you may be disappointed, don't give up. Just alter your expectations and put your efforts into things that are succeeding. So for example, this year we are likely to not get any pumpkins because of slug damage. However, we've had to just accept that and just focus where we could focus our attention, and just be flexible about where we put our efforts, and to just really be optimistic and be mindful that we just have to change our attention a little bit with what we are working on in the garden. And lastly, tip number 5, which is be encouraged. Often when we have difficult seasons, it is easy to be discouraged, but we can look at difficulties as opportunities to learn. If you think about it, if there were never problems or difficulties, there would be less opportunities to learn. And although it's been challenging, the previous years where we've had challenges have meant that we have had tools to add to our toolbox of techniques to mitigate against problems. And so although the squirrel issue was one problem we had not experienced, it gave us an additional learning and an additional tool to add to our toolbox of mitigating strategies. And so in the future, if we employ all our mitigation strategies, we have the best chance of maximizing our harvest, rather than relying on purely good fortune in order to hope for a good output. And there's a scripture which I'd like to share, which I think is very encouraging about how to respond in difficult times, because difficulties are not forever, and they allow us to look to the future for how things can be better. Joel chapter 2, 25 and 26, which reads, "And I will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten, the cankerworm, and the caterpillar, and the palmer worm, my great army which I sent among you. And ye shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, that hath dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be ashamed." So these were the 5 top tips for how to survive a difficult season. I hope they've helped. Do remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video. Take care. Bye.